Hello and welcome. This is Layron with the Fantasy Grounds Academy. Had a little technical difficulty in the first attempt, but here we are. Just a quick tip for those that stream or use OBS or the Discord app to stream. If you do an update in Windows, quite often your preset or that your settings for your audio get reset to factory, or it changes those settings. So make sure you go into your properties of your sound and reselect the settings that you have, like for your mic and your headset, because those get reset for some reason every time you update Streamlabs or you update your Discord or your Windows does that to you. So whenever Windows updates, for some reason it likes to reset those. So anyways, without further ado, right now what I'm going to cover are some things that come up during gameplay. Some of this stuff may not make any sense to you until you start playing or until you run a game, but I'm going to go ahead and put these out there. I guess you could say these are marketed more towards people that have already used Fantasy Grounds or they're just starting. If you're brand new to Fantasy Grounds, a lot of this might not make sense to you, but bear with me, and maybe some of these things you'll remember. But hopefully these will be helpful. So first things first, I want to preface this that I'm using the D&D 5e rule set. That's the rule set I'm most comfortable with, I'm most familiar with. So if you use Pathfinder or other rule sets, some of this stuff will apply depending on the situation and what it is. I also have a map. I have some players, NPCs on the combat tracker, so that you can tell like what I'm doing, and I'm going to show you some things that will make life a little easier on you, and also kind of demystify some of those annoying things that can come up during gameplay. So first things first is your actual layout. So quite often, newer players or people that have even been using this for a while have the complaint that there's not a lot of room on the desktop. I'm not going to argue with that because I do understand that, and that's what I ran into when I first started using Fantasy Grounds. First and foremost, you need a pretty good sized screen, like maybe 19 inches or more. If you have anything smaller than that, there's no guarantee that your experience is going to be that great, especially if you're the GM. Players might be able to get by with something smaller, but anything smaller than a 19-inch monitor is going to be really tough. The other thing is learning how the windows behave in Fantasy Grounds. So a lot of these windows can be moved around. There's only a few that can be locked and static, and that is this particular chat window and the dice tower if it's enabled. And then there might be one or this dice tray. You can also lock that. But everything else is kind of free floating. And when you first open something for the first time, you haven't opened it. Like over here on the right, I'm going to open backgrounds. Quite often, or 99% of the time, it's going to open straight up in the middle. So if it's something you haven't opened before, it's likely going to go in the middle. So obviously I've opened those up before, so they're not in the middle. But quite often you'll see that, and the only exception to being able to remember where your last location was is the character selection area, where you build characters and select characters. So this is because when you first log in, it's going to pop up so the players can claim their characters. So that'll always pop up in the middle no matter what you do. But the rest of these windows will keep their position. Once you open something, you resize it and then you move it to where you want it to go. So for instance, vehicles, the first time you open it, it might open up in the center. So these are just things like this feats. I haven't opened this up yet, so it's going to be in the middle. If you don't want this to happen again, you simply move it to where you want it to go, and you size the window. So maybe you want to change the dimensions of the window a little bit. You do that with the bottom right corner. And then once you close it, it's going to be in that spot for the rest of the campaign unless you move it. So if I open up that again, or if I open up the tables or whatever it is that you've moved, like maybe it's the tables, you want this to be down here. So take the time to move the windows, resize them, then close them, and then when you call those back up again, they will appear where you want them to go. So I'm doing that right now. So now if I go back to a parcel, that's not where I want it to go. I want it to be somewhere where I can see it, but it's not going to be covering everything that's important to me during a game session. So this is kind of the big fight with people that have Fantasy Grounds are kind of new, or they don't understand how this part works. So Most of these windows are not permanently anchored. The only one is the actual character selection window. The rest of these can be moved. So if I close this map, I already have it sized and I have it where I want it. So if I close that map, I have a shortcut down there at the bottom. If I click on it again, it's going to pop up where I left it and it's going to retain the size. That's an important thing to understand. But when you first open an image or a data link or anything new that you've never opened before, it's always going to set up in the center. And then at that point, you want to move it, resize it, and then close it if you don't need it. The next time you need it, though, you'll know kind of about where it's going to go, and hopefully not smack dab in the middle of the screen where you're working or playing. So that's a really helpful tip if you're new and you're getting frustrated with the Windows management. That's generally one of the things you can do to combat that. The other thing is, only have the things open that you need kind of thing, but you won't really know what you need until you play. So that will build and become more apparent to you as time goes on. Next thing is in the player mode. So as the GM, I actually have all of these different combat tracker entries in a deck of cards or a stack. So if I close all these are already sized, they're moved over, they're put in a position where I want them to go. So as I go down the combat tracker, I can actually click on the link on the right-hand side, and that will open up whatever NPC or character I'd like. So I can click on each one of these data links on the right-hand side in the combat tracker, and that will bring up the character sheet and the NPCs. I do this every encounter or every prep session if need be, depending on where we're at in combat. Usually the players stay in position. I don't have to worry about that, but when you're adding and taking away NPCs, those are the only ones you have to keep fiddling with. But nonetheless, I've already added these NPCs. These are the ones I'm going to use for this encounter. And when I want to bring up a specific NPC or player, I just click on the right-hand side, and that brings that entry to the top. So instead of having these spread out across the screen, I just have one pile. And that makes it so much easier to manage. It takes a lot less desktop space. Once in a while, you do have to have them side by side, but 9 times out of 10, you will only need the one at a time anyway. So it's better if you stack them somewhere, and when you need them, you can call them on the combat tracker if it's something that's on the combat tracker, and that will recall or bring up the last entry that you want to. When you click on these, it'll bring those up wherever you position them. So that kind of ties in with locating windows where you want them to go. And then once you've located them, when you access the button or the link for it, it brings it up where you want it, and not in the very center of the screen or somewhere else. So this is a good way to help conserve space. The other thing is players. If you are a player, you'll notice on the right-hand side, there's a bunch of tabs. The main one that you're going to spend the majority of your time once your character's built is the Actions tab. So down at the bottom, there are different modes. Right now, this character is in Combat and Actions mode. If you change this to Standard mode and you change this grouping here to Group or to Summary, this is just kind of the mode that you're in when you're building and updating your character. That's what this mode is for. The second mode is for preparing spells. You can also prepare usages and when they expire and when they recover, basically if like short rest or long rest. Or in this case, these are one-time use, so these are set at once. So once you use them, they don't come back after you rest. So there's different ways that you can set up your usages depending on what the feature is or what it is that your rate of recovery is. So it just depends. It might be a charge on a magic weapon, whatever it may be. But this is the mode that you're in when you're preparing for usages and for studying and having your spells ready to go, that sort of thing. The next mode is the mode that you'll be in the most, which is combat. And then over on the right where it says display, you want to change that to actions. This will show all the buttons that are associated with any actions that have automation or some kind of automatic application to it. And it'll be in a list view. And you can actually stretch the sheet out a little bit if it's too long. Quite often spellcasters get a huge list. So if that's the case, if you're not going to use the standard actions, let's say, or the consumables, you can collapse these particular areas that you're not going to be using. Like you might not need those sections, so you can actually collapse those. make this sheet a little bit shorter and not as much scrolling up and down. So that kind of helps with that. And that's the same thing with the combat tracker GMs. If you overload this combat tracker, eventually you're going to be scrolling back and forth, up and down, up and down. And that's really going to be irritating. So try to keep your encounters smaller and not as huge. Like, you don't need 10 goblins at once. You can do them in waves. Like, you can do a group of 5 initially and then wait a few rounds and then bring in another 5. Sometimes that may not make sense in the scope of the story or the battle, but in most cases you can get away with doing groups instead of a huge mob. So you can do little waves of goblins. Let's say you have a total of 20. You don't want to put all 20 of them on the combat tracker at once. Try to just kind of compartmentalize it. I wouldn't put more than 10. That's just my rule of thumb. If it's more than 10, then I'm going to have 10 entries in here plus all the players and NPCs. So that's going to get overloaded really quick. It also kind of wears down on the memory. It creates a little bit of lag, especially for your players if they don't have very fast computers or a lot of bandwidth. That's going to cause issues in the long run, potentially. It doesn't mean that's going to happen to everybody, but it does happen. Let's see, what else? Oh, some gameplay stuff that happens. So if you're a spellcaster, in this case, I'm Dorig, Weirdbeard, Rockfist. He's a dwarven cleric. So I want to bless the party here. This is a warhorse that belongs to our Lord Galamar. We have an elf here that's probably a spellcaster of some sort. And then we have Dorig. And then over here, all the bad guys. So I want to cast a bless spell before we go into combat. So whenever you want to know what area of effect or, how far the radius is, all you have to do is look at the description of the spell. So I'm looking at the bless spell down here, and you can open up and read this, and it says the range is 30 feet. So you can bless up to 3 creatures of your choice within range. Whenever a target makes an attack, they can roll and they get this bonus. So the range is 30 feet. Concentration, if you could see up to 3 creatures of your choice within range. So range of 30 feet. So you can actually right click, go to pointers. Now this is true of all rule sets, I think. Go to draw circle, and I'm going to go ahead and draw, left click and drag. And now I have this circle that kind of gives me an idea of where I can cast my spell, who's in the range of it. So right now it's only 2 of us, but if this player moves into range, obviously they're going to be benefit from the spell. Now this doesn't necessarily take in consideration targeting. This just gives you an idea of where the spell, who you can affect. So anything on the edge would be considered part of it as long as it's touching. Anything outside that's not touching is not in the area of effect. So if you have any edge cases where you got something that's half in and half out, more than likely they're going to be within the range. So this is just a tip about how to draw these circles. And when you're done, you can right click, go to pointers, and then you can remove it when you don't need it anymore. The other half of this is targeting. So right now on the combat tracker, I already have a bunch of people that have spell of bless on them. So I'm going to go to the menu. I'm going to rest them so that expires. So I'm going to go to the rest button and go to a long rest, and that should reset everything, in which it has. And now I'm going to target the individuals that I want to apply the bless spell to. So right now I'm going to clear all the targets, and I have a passive effect on right now, which is the Dwarven Resilience, resist poison. So what I want to do is when I find out and determine who all is in the range of my spell, or it could even be some kind of missile, magic missile, whatever it is, if it affects more than one target, you can actually target more than one individual at a time. So if I want to do that for bless, I can target up to 3 people according to the description of the spell. So you need to read the description of the spell before you do anything else. And once you understand how it works or what it's supposed to do, you're going to hold the control key and you're going to click on your targets. So Dorig here, the player, is going to click on Lord Galamar. He's going to click on the elf, and he's going to click on himself. So in the combat tracker, as you can see, under this targets area, it shows the 3 different targets. Once I have those guys targeted, I can apply the bless effect, and Fantasy Grounds will automatically apply it to whoever I have targeted. Now to reverse this, since I've already applied the target, I'm going to do the opposite, or basically repeat. So I'm just going to hold down Control and click on the targets to remove it, because I no longer need to target those guys. I've already applied the effect. This would be the same for attacks and anything else. If you don't intend to attack the same target over and over, you need to remove the targeting. That happens quite a bit, where a player will put the target on and forget about it, and then when they go to attack again, it attacks the wrong target. So that's why on the next topic, let's say you're fighting in close quarters or in a vicinity that's closed. So let's just say that Gallimar here wants to drag and drop damage onto this two-headed dog, Mule. So I'm going to go to the Lord Gallimar's turn here, and then I'm going to bring up his character sheet by clicking on the right-hand side. And then I'm going to go to his Actions tab. That's where all the magic happens. And then I'm going to take a look at his attack. So he's got a +1 longsword. So I'm going to swing at Mule. Let's see if we even get to hit. So I'll left-click and drag either to the combat tracker or to the token on the map. I can do either or. And that's part of the reason I have the character sheet here, because I can either use the map or I can use the combat tracker. So sometimes you don't have a map. It's all theater of the mind, so you can just do everything in the combat tracker. So I want to go ahead and take this attack roll, drag and drop it onto Mule, who is my enemy here in this case. So here's Mule. Very nice. So I attacked with advantage, it looks like. And I rolled a dirty 20, which is great. That is a hit, as indicated here. So now I'm going to drop the damage. So sometimes what happens is you get in a hurry, you're not paying attention, or when you go to left-click and drag, there's not enough room to drop the die on the map or in the combat tracker. So you can accidentally put that on the wrong person. So I'm going to take the damage, and I'm going to try to apply it to Mule, but I might accidentally apply it to myself. Oops. So I didn't want to do that. I accidentally dropped it on myself because the token was so close that I didn't realize that I dropped it on the wrong person, or perhaps that person was targeted and I was supposed to remove that target before. Or in the combat tracker, I might have tried to drag it over and I missed and I dropped it on the warhorse or somebody that's next to the entry that you're trying to drop it on. So what I'm getting at is you can reverse this either as the GM or the player. So in the chat window down below here is the damage, the 7, and then the status of that he's now wounded. So what I can do is right-click on this actual damage number, and you will click on this negate value, which is this positive and negative symbol. Once you do that, you can take this damage number, which is now reversed. It's going to act like a heal. So I can left-click and drag, and that cancels out the damage. So this is something you want to learn as a player and a GM. It makes life so much easier. This way your player, or your GM in this case, will not have to go and manually adjust it and have you start over. So that is just a way that you can fix something if you've accidentally dropped it or targeted the wrong thing. So that's kind of a simple way out of it. It's kind of hard to remember that sometimes, but all you have to do is right-click, click this negative value number, and that will reverse this number, and then you apply it to the target that you accidentally dropped it on. So that's something that you'll know and learn over time. The next thing is movement. It's very difficult for players when they have their token on the map to determine where exactly the occluder lines are. So for this instance, I'll say I want to move Dorig. So I'm going to go back to his entry here. I'm going to move him 25 feet, but I'm going to accidentally move it through this wall because I don't know there's a wall there necessarily. So you don't see the occluder, right? You just see like a blob, or you might see some of the wall there. So that's why it's important when you do line of sight that you don't have it right up to the edge, because now you can't even tell what this is. So Fantasy Grounds does not prevent players from dragging their movement through a wall or clipping a corner. So for example, let's say Dorig here wants to go around the wall. but he's got this guy in the way. So the DM says, yeah, you can move through there, but you're going to lose 10 feet because it's crowded in there. So he's like, fine, whatever. So I'm going to hold down the Alt key as the GM to emulate player movement. So he can move 15 feet. But what happens is, in this case, it was fine because he went around the object. However, he can technically trace through the occluder. So this might cause a problem. It might be problematic. So let me give an example. He wants to go, let's say he's right here, and he wants to come down next to Lord Gallimar. So what players will do sometimes is they will drag it through a wall. So instead of going around the wall, they're trying to go through it. So Fantasy Grounds does not block this movement here. It actually will accept it as a movement. So it doesn't know there's an occluder there. So when you hit go or OK, they get stuck in the wall. That's rather annoying. You also lose the amount of feet that they possibly moved. So the first step in that is just don't approve the movement. So if you see that, don't approve it. Just say, hey, you're going to go through a wall and you're going to get stuck. So go ahead and just cancel it and have them retrace it. So the right way to do it would be to come down here. Something like that. So your players aren't always going to be a good judge of what's on the map and what isn't. And if the map's not very detailed, or there's no terrain defined or anything like that, it's really hard to tell. So as the game master, you have to adjudicate or decide what is going to fly and what isn't. So when the person is making a turn, especially in a tactical situation, you have to consider that if they move through an ally, they're going to lose 5 or 10 feet. I think the rule is 10 feet for rough terrain. If they move through this rubble, I would consider that rough terrain. If they try to climb a wall, that's another action that they'll have to do to climb up, unless it's a bonus action. And then also moving through enemies, you cannot do that. I mean, Fantasy Grounds doesn't prevent it, but players will try to trace their movement through an enemy. So, for example, like that. That's not a good move. In D&D 5e, you cannot move through enemy targets like that. So I would cancel that. So these are the kind of things that you're going to run into when you're playing the game. And as players, you have to pay attention to the terrain and ask before you move. And try not to cut through corners, because I've seen that so many times where people cut through. And there are some times when there's a small area that's less than 5 feet or a doorway, and you got 3 or 4 people stacked up in there, you can get crowded in there and you'll end up getting stuck. So if that's the case, if you are the game master, this is game master only, you can move the token wherever you want if you hold down the shift key. So the shift key is your friend as the game master. If you need to move the tokens to a completely different part of the map, instead of moving them all the way through the maze or through all this stuff, you can simply hold the shift key and move them where you want without having to go through the entire or moving around. So that's a good thing to use if you need to move your tokens far away or all the way across a map, or maybe your players are stuck. So that's how you fix that. Players don't have that ability. It's a GM function only. But at least you don't have to remove them off the combat tracker and all that stuff. You don't need to do that. So that is just a way that you can make life easier on you as a game master. And one final thing is, if you are a player or a game master, and let's say you accidentally close all this stuff down, or maybe you close your character sheet, or maybe you close the map, whatever. First and foremost, if you're a GM, you should probably have the map shortcut so that you can find it easily. And if you do accidentally close it, it's easy to bring back up. The other thing you can do as a player is, if you forget or you close your character sheet, if you're on the combat tracker, all you have to do is click on the link on the far right. That'll bring up your character sheet. If your character is actually on a map, double click on the right hand side on the token, and it will bring the last map that you were on up to the front. So that is a way that you can get through the interface if you lose or close anything, or if it gets stuck underneath something. Just double click on the right on the combat tracker, and then double click on the right on the token on your character sheet, and that'll bring the map back up. So that's a handy tip for players and GMs if you lose the window that you were working in, or it's something that gets lost or buried underneath other stuff. So the last and final piece of this is player preparedness. So a lot of times players will be digging through the rules and trying to find stuff. Really, the only things that you probably need for most sessions is the initiative roll, which is on the front of your character sheet on the main tab. So you can actually drag and drop this down to the hotkeys. So now if I want to roll initiative, I can click from the hotkeys instead of coming all the way back to this part and doing it here. Nothing wrong with dragging it from here or double clicking, but when you're on the actions tab 90% of the time, it makes it so much easier just to do it from the hotkeys. The next thing is skills. You don't have to shortcut every single skill on here, but quite often the GM will ask for a skill like perception. So you take this total number here on the right, drag and drop it onto the hotkey, and then maybe one other. So this guy is insight, he's a rogue. So I'm going to take his stealth and put it down here. So stealth and perception, those are my top two skills. I'm doing that to limit the amount of times that I have to keep flipping over to different tabs on my character sheet. So this will give you your combat initiative, your top 2 or 3 skills. And then if you want to remember to pass your turn, which is something that players often forget, even GMs. So when you're done with your turn, you're supposed to click on next action or turn complete. A lot of times there's people where they try to remember and they forget, or their turn's over and they space out or whatever, or they're not paying attention. So what you want to do is take this little action button. It might be an arrow. It might look a little different, but you just left click and drag it to your hotkeys. The advantage of this is that you're not reaching all the way over here, and it's next to all your other shortcuts, so it helps remind you that you have to pass your turn when your turn's done. It's not a guarantee, but it does make it a little bit more visible. And last but not least, you're going to be on the Actions tab 90% of the time. So that's why we have those shortcuts down here. You don't need a zillion of them, just enough to kind of get by, just to have enough to play and to make it to where it's easier for you. If you have a spell that you're constantly forgetting, or you don't remember what it does half the time, you can open up the spell to read it and then left click and drag it into the hotkeys. So that way you have quick access to it, and you do that with the spells that you're unfamiliar with or the features that you forget. That way you don't dig around your sheet looking for it. So if you have an ability and you forget what it does, let's say cunning action, if you bring this up, you can actually highlight and drag this down to the hotkeys, and then whenever you need to use that, it's quicker to get to it because you're going to be on the Actions tab most of the time on your character sheet. So if it's something like that and you don't want to quit going through all these tabs looking for it, just take the ones that you're unfamiliar with or the ones that you're going to need for your session and put them down here in the hotkeys. Now, you're not always going to know what those are every time. It's going to take you a while to customize what exactly you use a lot, those sort of things, but that's what those shortcuts are for, really, just to kind of make things a little quicker and easier to access. Once you have that down and you understand what features you have and how the character sheet is laid out, it really makes a difference in your play, and you'll be really on the spot and less likely to have to dig through everything just to find something. You want to try to use Fantasy Grounds as it's designed and not fight it so much. A lot of people fight the interface instead of actually learning how it works. So these are just tips that you might use during your gameplay or when you're running a session. Most of this stuff applies to most of the rule sets, except for maybe some of the combat stuff that might be different from Starfinder or Pathfinder or one of the other rule sets. But most of these tips are universal. These are things that you're going to see and get annoyed with, and this will make your game much faster if you kind of pick and choose some sort of way that you set up your table and how you organize it. Once you get that down, it is so much cleaner, so much easier, and a heck of a lot less frustrating. So hopefully this is helpful. I want to invite all of you to join our Fantasy Grounds Academy if you need help, inspiration, or you just want to ask questions. Also, at the end of July, coming up in about a month or so, we have our Founders Day 6 weekend, which is going to be, July 28th through the 30th. We already have the signups for game masters and people that want to present things. And then we're going to open up the games and such in the beginning of July, like the first week of July. That way players can sign up. But nonetheless, hopefully this is helpful. If you don't like this content, so be it. But go ahead and give me a follow and a like if it's something that you like and something useful. And I'm also going to do little shorts on this kind of stuff so the videos are not so long.